Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting this fish shop storefront. This is based on a storefront that I saw on my trip to Slovenia a couple of years ago, and my friend recommended this quaint little restaurant that is always fully packed. It's just a small window where you place your orders, and I've been wanting to paint this, so I'm really happy that I finally got the chance to. So those were the videos and reference picture that I tried to work from. Here I've just sketched out my version, which I've simplified and added some decorative plants and flowers to make the painting a bit more lively and colorful. Feel free to also add your own flair to this if you want. But yeah, I just tried to do a really light sketch on my sketchbook before I start to paint. Since the window counters the main subject matter, I want to make sure I've positioned and sized it correctly within my page. The rough sketch that I made actually has a wider dimension, so I will try to stretch certain things to fit the length of my sketchbook. This is an A5 size, so if I want to make the wider composition, I would have a lot of space at the bottom and the top, which is why I've decided to stretch it instead. However, if you're painting yours on just a single piece of watercolor paper, feel free to cut off the top and bottom so you can paint with a wider dimension. As usual, when I'm sketching these sort of compositions, I always try to sketch it as light as possible. I try to sketch without too much pressure so I don't risk damaging my paper. And by the way, if you want to get straight to painting, I'll of course have this outline available in my coffee shop. The little fish hanging are seat numbers, and I realized that in my rough sketch they look bigger in ratio and it looks cuter that way, but sadly I didn't recognize it when I was painting mine, so just a heads up if you want to increase the size of yours. Our eyes tend to gravitate towards faces, and since I don't want to make this worker the focal point of the drawing, I positioned her in a way where the face is hidden behind the window. She's there, but the main subject will still be the storefront. Next, I'll go over the colors that I'm going to be using. This is Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Compost Blue by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Terre Verte by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, and Bleed-Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martens. I'm also going to be using a couple of pens. This drawing pen is to outline. This is by Snowman and it's 0.1. I'm also going to use a white pen to draw on top of the chalkboards. This one is unbranded, but you can use something like a jelly roll or a uniball. Now let's start to paint. At the top, there were no flowers, but I'm going to add some blue flowers because I saw a lot of these when I was in Slovenia. I'm going to use a mixture of compost blue with a bit of crimson lake, and I'm going to use a light to medium consistency for the base. I like to make dots with my brush in bunches to suggest a group of small flowers. In the middle of the space, I made the silhouette of the flowers circular. Some are smaller while others are bigger, but on the sides I make them bunch into small curves or even half circles since we might be looking at some of these flowers from the sides. I'm going to build on the form, so I'm using a darker blue. This just has a bit more crimson lake in the ratio. I'm placing this darker blue by still using the same dotting motion, but I'm placing them at the bottom of the bunches. Next, I'm going to paint the surrounding greenery. So I'm going to start with a light yellow-green. This is from a mix of Terre Verte and Hansa Yellow Medium. I'm going to use a light to medium consistency again, placing this at the center for the lighter areas, but I still try to somewhat randomize the placing so it doesn't just look like a straight line. Then surrounding it, I'm going to use more Terre Verte in the mixture for a slightly darker green, and I'm not waiting for the lighter green areas to dry because I want this to have a slight wet on wet effect, so the paint will just somewhat spread into each other, creating soft gradations. For a more muted green, I added a little bit of Crimson Lake and also the blue mixture from the flowers. And I like to use this dark green to place underneath the flowers so it looks like they're shadows. and that some of the flowers are sitting on top of the greeneries. For the edges of the greeneries, I try to make it look lighter and more dynamic with the light green by making them look uneven. And I also try to spread some of the leaf textures so they're kind of further apart from each other. And I also like to extend certain areas so they're longer than others. In front of the window, I'm going to turn this into a chili plant so I can add some yellows and some reds, starting with the light consistency of Hansa Yellow Medium. Then on the damp surface, I'm going to add some vermilion and a thicker consistency. Once I'm done, I want them to somewhat be fairly dry so I can paint the greeneries around it, and I'm going to treat this similarly to how I painted the flowers for the top of the storefront. I'm using the same color mixtures, but I'm going to play with the ratio so the green looks slightly more muted here. After this, I want to enrich the red of the peppers, so I just added a bit of Crimson Lake into the red mixture, and I'm going to paint over or paint some of the sides of these peppers. For the tree in front of the store, I'm going to turn this into an orange tree just so I can include more fun colors. I use an orange mixture from Hansa Yellow and Vermilion for the base. Then I like to create the orb form instead of a flat circle by adding more vermilion. As for the greeneries, again, I'm just going to treat it the same way as I did the previous plants, but this time I'm using a bit more Hansa Yellow in the mixture for a slightly brighter tone of green. For the dark muted green, I also added a little bit of vermilion, and I'm going to place it under the oranges. Now for the stems and the branches, I'm going to create a dark brown by mixing indigo with Crimson Lake Vermilion and a bit of Hansa Yellow. For the base, I used a lot of vermilion so you can see the color is a reddish brown. But to darken it, I just added a bit more indigo and Hansa Yellow in the mix. Next, for the potted flowers on the right hand side, I'm going to make this peachy pink color from vermilion and bleed-proof white. After creating the light base, I just added bits of vermilion under some of the flowers. Then of course, I'm going to paint the greenery surrounding the flowers. As for the flowers in front, I'm going to use compost blue and a very light consistency for the base, and I added a little bit of indigo into the compost blue for the darker colors. I feel like this one is a bit faded, so I'm going to add a thick consistency of compost blue to increase the saturation of some of the flowers. For pots, I always like to use a terracotta color because I feel like it has a really nice contrast with greens. And this is just from a mix of the browns that I've already pre-mixed on my palette, and I just added more vermilion into the mix. And if I want to darken the brown, I would just add more indigo. For the hanging fish numbers, I'm going to use a mix of bleed-proof white and some compost blue. And in the middle, I'm going to use a yellow. So that's from Vermilion, Hansa Yellow Medium, and a little bit of that bleed-proof white as well. I've forgotten about this pot, so I'm just using the same mix. And as you can see, this is a little bit more orangey compared to the other pots because in the other pots, I've added more indigo in the ratio. With the same terracotta color, I painted the edge of the counter, but for the top, I'm going to use a dark brown from the same mix with added Crimson Lake and indigo. While the surface is still damp, I added a thick consistency underneath all the items for shadows, and while I wait for this to dry, I'm going to paint the bottom of the counter using the same color. Here I actually painted over my outline because I didn't realize I couldn't see it properly on the left. I tried to take it off with tissue, but I couldn't take off everything, but that's completely fine. I will fix that later on. But after I'm done with this base, I want to make sure that the edge of the counter is completely dry so I can paint the shadow underneath. I've gotten tired creating that terracotta mixture, so I just use Quin Sienna with indigo in a thick consistency. I'm going to paint the rest of the counter using the same mixture. So this is from Quin Sienna and indigo. I'm using a medium consistency for the base. I'm being very careful to paint around the greeneries at the top as well as the surrounding items. And while the surface is still damp, I want to add shadows underneath the greeneries. This is with the same mix with more indigo. I'm going to wait for them to dry and go back to the bottom of the counter. This area should also be fairly dry by now. If not, you can use a hairdryer to make the process quicker. But here I'm just going to use a thin consistency of brown to kind of map out the panels. I'm also trying to use a variety of browns so this area doesn't look too flat and monotone. Next, I'm going to lightly paint the walls next to the window. For the base color, I'm using a thin consistency of Jaune Brilliant Dark, but around the corners, I like to darken it slightly by using some yellow ochre as well as a little bit of vermilion. While the surface is still damp, I'm also going to add the same color mixture right underneath the greeneries for shadows. And I'm also going to do the same thing for the right hand side. You can see that there are some boards here, but I'm just going to paint over them since I'm just using a light consistency for now. But for the light reddish brown, I'm going to paint in between those boards, so there's a light cast shadow. Once I'm done, I'm just going to dry everything off before adding any more details on top. I'm going to paint the frames. This is for the frames on the counter as well as on the wall. This is just the browns that I've already pre-mixed on my palette. This has indigo and Quin Sienna. And I also added a lot of yellow ochre to brighten the color. On the left, there's this upside down looking fish frame where they usually display their menus. The frame is black, so I'm going to use a mix of Quin Sienna with a lot of indigo in the ratio. After this, using the same black, I'm just going to paint the blackboards. And while doing this, I don't mind if I leave out some little white spots because I find that this just brings a little bit more looseness to the painting and it also lightens it slightly. I'm going to make the board stand out a little bit more against the wall. And here I'm just using the same brown mixture, but this has more yellow ochre and vermilion in the mix. And I'm also going to use a dark brown to paint right underneath these boards. I'm going to enhance the shadows here, and this is from a mix of indigo and crimson lake. For the tip jar, I just used the gray from indigo and Quin Sienna, but in a very light consistency to paint around it. Then for the rest of the window, I'm just going to paint it very lightly because I don't want the details to take away from the actual storefront. I'm using a thin consistency of light grays and Jaune Brilliant Dark because it's just a light color. I'm just actually placing it randomly while leaving out some white lines in between to suggest some shells in the background. You can actually pick any colors you want from this. You can see I have some purples, and that's from a mix of indigo and crimson lake. Just make sure to use a light consistency, so all the colors are very light. I feel like there's a lot of space at the top, so I decided to fill it in with more flowers and also some greeneries. This is optional, it just depends on your composition. Next, I'm going to paint the skin of the worker. You can see there's a bit of vermilion and blue on my palette, and I added some yellow ochre and a bit of Jaune Brilliant Dark in a very light consistency. For the uniform, she'll be wearing a white striped shirt. So here I'm just going to darken some shadows using the gray mixture in a very thin consistency. I'm going to leave it to dry and paint the hair. Doesn't matter, you can paint it black, brown, or blonde. Then once the base of the shirt is completely dry, I'm going to use the same mixture of the gray but in a thick consistency to create a black for the stripes. Next, I'm going to add some darker details. I'm going to add some cast shadows underneath the plants and also the line details for the storefront itself. For this, you can use any dark colors, but I like to use a mix of Crimson Lake with indigo or Quin Sienna with indigo. I'm also going to add some cast shadows right under the counter, and this is from Indigo and Crimson Lake. Sometimes I like to just dot in a bit more indigo here and there randomly. I start with a light consistency, and as the paint settles and the colors fade, I'm going to add a bit more pigment to darken certain areas. I'm going to layer a bit more detail behind on the worker. I'm going to add more shelvings. I'm still using a very light consistency of the gray mixture. I'm going to add darker shadows for the table numbers. And for the blue, I use a mix of compost blue and indigo. As for the yellow one, I just use the brown mixture with added Hansa yellow medium. Then I'm going to use the black to paint the string holding it up, or the rope. As for the numbers, I'm going to use a thick consistency of bleed-proof white, or you can also use a white pen. The blackboards on the right has faded in colors, so I'm going to layer on more black, but while doing this I want to leave out quite a bit of the previous layer showing to suggest some light reflections. I decided to show a bit of the top frame of the window showing to have a bit more contrast between the green and the dark brown. Then once the blackboards are completely dry, now I can add the list of menus. I'm just doing scribbles here, but you can also change up the color. You can actually paint on top of this white if you say want to make it like a colored chalk instead. Once I'm done, I'm going to add the outlines using my pen or the empty blackboard in front. I'm going to add a little fish just for an extra cutesy detail. And I'm just going to outline the rest of the elements, especially if they're a bit blurry from the painting. I felt like the white numbers weren't showing too well against the light colored background, so I decided to outline it as well. Then after this, I'm basically done painting everything, but I want to increase the saturation or the value of certain areas just so I can increase the contrast, especially for the counter. I feel like this needs to stand out a little bit more, so there's a bit more contrast between the worker in the background as well as what's happening in front. So I'm just going to go over certain areas again. These additions will just depend on your current painting, and this is more or less just balancing out the details and the colors. After darkening certain spots, I feel like I need to layer a bit more in the background and pretend there are things sitting on the shelves as well, and that's basically it for this painting. I had so much fun with this. I do wish that this was a bit wider though in terms of the composition, but I just work with the dimension that I have. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!